For 30 winters, Hollister spoke to no one but the wind. He lived on a ridge that scraped the sky, a place of sharp rock and silent pines. His only company was the ghost of his wife, Ruth, and the ache in his bones that never quite went away. The world below had forgotten him, and he had forgotten it right back. He was a man carved from grief, content to let the silence swallow him whole. But one night, that silence shattered. It started with a knock, not the familiar slam of a branch in the wind or the scrape of a bear against the siding. This was a pattern, knuckles on wood, measured, desperate, human. Hollister hadn't had a visitor in 30 years. The last man who tried to climb his ridge uninvited had left with a bullet in his thigh and a clear understanding that this mountain was not for company. He sat frozen in his chair, the fire burning low. The knock came again, weaker this time, almost pleading. He thought about ignoring it. He thought about letting the storm outside handle it. A storm like this didn't care about history or bones or blood. It was an eraser. But something in that knock felt different. It wasn't a challenge. It was a prayer. Slowly, his old legs complaining, he stood. He reached for the shotgun leaning against the wall, the cool metal a familiar comfort in his hands. He didn't aim it. He just held it, a piece of his old life, as he unlatched the heavy wooden door and pulled it open. What he saw stole the breath from his lungs. 10 women stood huddled in the swirling snow. Their blankets were soaked through, their hair stiff with ice. Their faces were hollowed out by a hunger so deep it looked like it had carved them from the inside. But their spines, somehow, were still straight. They stood like ancient trees that refused to fall. The woman at the front was barefoot, her toes already turning a dark, angry blue in the snow. She spoke, but not in English. Her voice was a raw, broken thing, cracked by the cold. She was holding something tight against her chest, hidden beneath her tattered blanket. It could have been a child. It could have been a wound. Hollister didn't understand her words. He didn't need to. He saw the story in their eyes, in the tremble of their hands, in the way they looked past him, as if seeing something terrible in the distance. He stood aside, holding the door open. One by one, they filed into the warmth of his cabin. They moved like ghosts, their eyes barely leaving the floor. The youngest couldn't have been more than a girl of 15. The eldest looked as old as the mountain itself. One woman leaned heavily on another, her leg twisted at an unnatural angle. All of them carried a silence so profound it felt heavier than the storm itself. He shut the door, and the world outside vanished. The wind howled, but in here, there was only the sound of their ragged breathing and the crackle of the fire he now stoked higher. He set down the shotgun. He moved slowly, carefully, not wanting to spook them. He didn't ask questions. He didn't speak a single word. He just handed the youngest girl a tin cup of boiled water and watched as her fingers trembled too hard to hold it steady. Only after they were all huddled by the fire, their blankets steaming, their eyes glassy with a pain far older than this single winter, did Hollister feel it. It was a crack in the foundation of his world. The wind had ripped open his 30 years of silence and let something impossible inside. He didn't know their names. He didn't know their story. He only knew that for the first time since he buried Ruth, his cabin didn't feel empty. It felt dangerously, terrifyingly full. He gave them his own bed and slept on the floor by the door, the shotgun back in his hands. Not because he was afraid of them. He was afraid of what had driven them here. Morning came, but the storm didn't break. The snow fell in a thick, suffocating curtain, sealing them off from the rest of the world. Hollister watched them as they slept, a tangle of limbs and sorrow on his floor. Each one was thinner than a person should be, their bones like sharp ridges beneath their skin. He saw the barefoot woman's feet. Frostbite. The toes were swollen, raw, and weeping. Without a word, he rummaged through the old trunk at the foot of his bed. Ruth's trunk. He pulled out salves, thick wool socks, anything that might bring back life to frozen flesh. When the woman stirred, she saw him standing over her with the ointment in his hand. She flinched, a sharp, terrified movement, clutching her hidden bundle even tighter. Her eyes were wide with a fear that cut him to the quick, and that's when he realized. The bundle wasn't just a bundle, it was a baby, wrapped so tight, so still, that it barely looked alive. He hadn't heard it cry. He hadn't seen it move. Was it even breathing? He didn't push. He didn't speak. He just nodded, his face calm, and set the salve down by the fire. He turned his back and left her to decide whether to trust him. It was a small gesture, but on a mountain like this, trust was the only currency that mattered. By evening, she had used the salve. Her feet were wrapped in strips of linen. He saw the tension in her shoulders ease, just a fraction. She looked at him, and for the first time, her eyes weren't filled with pure terror. She tried to speak again, pointing from the still silent baby to the roof above them, her words clipped and desperate. Then she put her hand to her chest. "Hosa," she said. It was the first word he understood. He blinked, processing it. "Is that your name?" he asked, his voice rough from disuse. She gave a single, sharp nod. He pointed to himself. Hollister. The other women watched the exchange in silence. No one else spoke, but something in the room shifted. It was as if the air itself remembered how to be shared, how to carry more than one person's grief. A tiny crack had appeared in their wall of silence. The next day, he cleared out his storage room. He hauled cots he hadn't used in decades from the old shed, hung blankets over the windows to block the drafts, and made space. He wasn't just making space in his cabin. He was making space in his life, in the rigid, lonely routine he had built for 30 years. He didn't know how long they would stay. He didn't ask. He just kept the fire fed and the water boiled. On the 4th day, another woman spoke. She had a scar that ran from her jawline to her temple, and eyes so dark they looked like they had been painted on with ink. "Alawa," she said, her voice a low rumble. Her English was broken, but her story was sharp enough to cut. Their village was gone. Not just attacked, erased. Soldiers had come with fire and rifles, and they had burned everything. The men fought. The men died. The women who survived had been forced to run with nothing. They were not allowed weapons. They were not allowed to carry the memory of what was theirs. They had walked for days, losing 3 of their sisters to the brutal cold. They buried them under cairns of rocks, without tears, because there was no time for tears. There was only time for walking, only time for surviving. And now they were here, in a white man's cabin, trusting a stranger with a shotgun because the world had left them no other choice. Hollister listened to every word, his face a mask of stone. When she was finished, he stood up, went outside into the storm, and slaughtered one of his goats. He made a rich, thick stew and fed them until the shaking finally stopped, until their bellies were full for the first time in weeks. That night, he didn't sleep by the door. He sat in his chair, holding the old, leather-bound Bible that had belonged to Ruth. He flipped through the pages, not reading the verses, just letting the soft rustle of the paper fill the silence. One of the younger girls, Taita, crept over and sat on the floor beside him. She just watched him, her gaze fixed on the way his worn fingers turned each page. "God's words," he murmured, not even sure if she understood. She reached out a small, hesitant hand and touched the leather cover. Then she looked up at him, her eyes ancient and young at the same time, and whispered a single word. "Safe." He didn't know if she meant the book, or the cabin, or him. But the word lodged itself in his chest and stayed there, a small, warm coal in the cold emptiness. Weeks turned into a month. The storm finally broke, but the peace it left behind was fragile. The women began to mend. Hosa's baby, Nanton, finally let out a weak, wavering cry. It was the most beautiful sound Hollister had ever heard. It meant the boy was alive, just weak. Hollister found himself working from dawn till dusk. He built a new stove with a proper oven. They baked bread. The smell filled the cabin, chasing away the ghosts. The older women taught the younger ones how to trap rabbits. Hosa even began to smile, a small, tentative thing that transformed her entire face. It almost felt like a new beginning, but peace never lasts on a mountain. Not in a world where men crave power more than they crave decency. One morning, Hollister found tracks in the fresh snow, boot prints, horseshoes, not passing by, circling. 2 days in a row, the same pattern. Someone was watching them. He didn't sleep that night. He sat on the porch in the biting cold, oiling his rifle, his eyes scanning the dark, silent trees. Hosa came out, holding Nanton close, her face etched with worry. "Is something wrong?" she whispered. He just nodded towards the woods. "Someone's watching." She didn't have to ask who. She knew. They all knew. The world they had run from was not done with them yet. It was patient, and it was coming. The stillness of the next morning was a lie. Hollister felt it in his bones, the same unnatural quiet that comes before a lightning strike. The tracks were back, but this time they were closer. Someone had crept right to the edge of his clearing, to the smokehouse where his winter meat was curing, and then turned back. It was a scout's pattern, a test. They were seeing how he would react. They were enjoying the fear they assumed he was feeling. They probably thought he was just some blind old rancher, an easy target, hiding something they wanted. They didn't know Hollister. Not yet. He called Alawa and Hosa outside, his voice low and grim. He pointed to the prints in the snow. "We've got eyes on us. They'll come closer next time." He didn't try to soften it. Truth was a tool, and right now, it was the only weapon they had. Alawa's jaw tightened, the scar on her face turning a pale white. Hosa clutched Nanton so tightly, the baby whimpered, but neither woman looked like she wanted to run. "We stand," Alawa said, her voice like flint. "Or we vanish." Hollister gave a grim nod. "Then we prepare." His cabin wasn't a fortress, but it was built solid from stone and stubbornness. He spent the day reinforcing the shutters. He stacked firewood high against the lower windows, creating a makeshift barrier. He went into the woods and set snares, not for rabbits this time, but for the boots of men who crept in the dark. Inside, the women found their own steel. Hosa and the older women sharpened every kitchen knife they had, their movements quick and precise. The younger ones hauled bucket after bucket of water from the well, filling every pot and barrel they could find, in case the attackers tried to burn them out or damage the pump. It wasn't much, but it was something. It was a choice. And that mattered. Night fell like a shroud. No one slept. They took turns at the windows, watching, listening. Hollister sat in his chair by the door, the shotgun resting across his knees, every muscle coiled tight. For the first time in 30 years, when he closed his eyes, he didn't dream of Ruth. He dreamed of shadows with guns stamping out his fire, one boot at a time. He woke with a jolt just before dawn. Smoke. Real smoke, acrid and thick, not from his own chimney. He burst outside into the freezing air. The smokehouse was a pillar of fire, flames chewing through the roof and licking at the sky. All his winter meat, days and days of work, was turning to ash. But that wasn't the message. The message stood at the edge of the clearing. 3 men on horseback. They didn't shout, they didn't charge, they just sat there, silhouettes against the rising flames, watching their handiwork. One of them, the leader, slowly raised a hand in a lazy, mocking wave. Then, with an arrogance that made Hollister's blood boil, they turned their horses and trotted back into the woods, disappearing as silently as they had come. They were gone before he could even raise his rifle, but the message was delivered. "We know you're here. We know you're hiding something. And we will be back to take it." Alawa swore, a string of harsh, guttural words in her own tongue. Hosa had tears in her eyes, but they weren't tears of fear. They were tears of pure, unadulterated fury. Hollister looked from their faces to the crying infant in Hosa's arms. "This won't stop here," he said, his voice flat. "They're testing us, seeing how far they can push before we break. Alawa drew a sharp breath. Then let them push. We will push back. He admired her fire, but he knew the cold math of their situation. 10 unarmed women, a baby, an old man with 1 shotgun and a revolver, no town to ride to, no sheriff to call for help. Just them, a burned-out smokehouse, and a winter that was closing in around them. Still, he had made his stand on this mountain before. He would make it again. He spent the rest of the day teaching them. He showed them how to load the shotgun, how to pack the powder and shot. He let each of them feel its weight, understand its power. He took the old revolver from Ruth's trunk. It only had 3 rounds left. He handed it to Hosa. "Only if you have to," he said, showing her how to aim, how to squeeze the trigger without flinching. "But if you do, don't you dare miss." She nodded, her eyes as hard as stone. They waited. The attack didn't come that night or the next. The ruins of the smokehouse smoldered, a constant stinking reminder of their vulnerability. The fear was a living thing in the cabin, a cold spot in the center of the room that no fire could warm. Then the baby got sick. Nanton's cries became weak and whimpering. His skin was hot to the touch, a raging fever burning through his tiny body. Hosa rocked him, her face a mask of terror. "He's too small," she whispered to Hollister, tears tracking paths through the soot on her cheeks. "He won't last." Hollister didn't have medicine, but he remembered things Ruth used to do. He went out and stripped bark from a willow tree, boiling it into a bitter tea. He rubbed his palms with pine tar until they were warm and laid them on the child's chest, letting the steam work its way into his lungs. Hosa watched his every move, her eyes memorizing a prayer made of bark and steam. For 2 days, the baby hovered between life and death. Then, on the 3rd morning, the fever broke. Hope returned to the cabin, a fragile, trembling thing, but alive. That evening, as Hollister was fixing the hinge on the front door, something landed in the snow at his feet, with a soft thwump. It was an arrow. No sound, no warning, just a shaft of dark wood and a flint tip quivering in the cold ground. He crouched slowly, his body screaming at him that he was exposed. He picked it up. The fletching was distinctive, Apache make, but not from Alawa's people. He knew the markings. He took it inside and showed it to Alawa. The color drained from her face. "That is the mark of the Red Rock clan," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "They believe we betrayed our people by running from the soldiers. They believe we are cowards." She looked from the arrow to the door, her eyes wide with a new kind of horror. "That arrow means they are watching too." It wasn't just the white men from the valley anymore. Now it was their own kind. They were trapped, surrounded by enemies who wanted them dead for different reasons. No one wanted them, no one in the world. Except him. He threw the arrow into the fire and watched it burn. He sat down hard in his chair, the weight of it all pressing down on him. "No one is coming to save us," he said, the words tasting like ash. No one argued. The truth was as cold and hard as the ground outside. Hosa came and sat on the floor beside his chair. She reached out and placed her small, warm hand over his gnarled, cold fingers. "You saved us once," she whispered. He looked at her, really looked at her. Not just a starving refugee, but a mother with the strength of a grizzly, a survivor forged in fire. "I just opened a door," he rasped. She shook her head, a faint smile touching her lips. "You opened your heart." He couldn't answer that. He didn't have the words. That night, for the first time in years, Hollister prayed, not with words, but with a silent, desperate plea sent up to a heaven he wasn't sure was listening. A plea for strength, for fire, for mercy, not for himself, for them. In the middle of that silent prayer, he heard it, a soft crunch of snow just outside the door. He grabbed the rifle, his heart hammering against his ribs. He flung the door open, ready for a fight. Standing there was a boy, Apache, no older than 12, thin as a rail, with eyes that had seen too much. He didn't speak. He just held out a bundle of dried jerky, laid it carefully on the doorstep, and then turned and vanished back into the trees like smoke. Hollister stood frozen, the cold air burning his lungs. Was it a warning? A gift? Or another crueler kind of test? He picked up the meat, his mind reeling. He took it inside, his gaze locking with Alawa's over the fire. The mountain wasn't done with them yet, not by a long shot. The bundle of dried meat sat on the table, a silent testament to the mystery surrounding them. No one touched it. They watched it as if it might spring to life, a coiled snake in the center of their sanctuary. Was it poisoned? Was it a trick? Or was it something else entirely? Hollister didn't sleep. He sat by the low-burning fire, the rifle a permanent extension of his arms, listening. He listened to the wind whisper its secrets through the eaves. He listened to the ice shifting on the roof. He listened for the snap of a twig that would signal the end of their fragile peace. By morning, fresh snow had fallen, burying the tracks of the ghost boy, erasing any proof he had ever been there. But Hollister saw new tracks, not near the cabin, on the north ridge, 5 or 6 sets of footprints. They had circled the clearing, a scout's patrol, measuring their defenses, watching their every move from the tree line. They were being encircled, hemmed in. He went back inside and said nothing. He just poured water into the iron kettle, his movements slow and deliberate. But the women knew. They saw it in the set of his jaw, in the way his eyes kept scanning the windows. They came again, Alawa stated. It wasn't a question. Hollister nodded. Hosa voiced the fear they all felt. Are they waiting for something? Waiting for us to run, he muttered. Or weaken. He didn't say the other possibility out loud, that they were just waiting for the right moment, for the deepest dark of night, to attack. That afternoon, a small, chilling discovery. As Taida folded blankets by the fire, a single feather fell out. It was smooth and black, with a silver tip. It wasn't from any bird on this mountain. Hollister stared at it, a cold dread seeping into his bones. He knew what it was, a marker, a claim. He took it without a word and threw it into the flames. That night, they huddled together. They sang, their voices soft and tentative, a mixture of old hymns from Ruth's book and quiet Apache lullabies from a life that felt 1,000 years away. The baby Nantons slept peacefully in a basket lined with rabbit fur. For a few hours, in the warm glow of the fire, it almost felt like a home. Until the scream ripped the night apart. It came from outside, a woman's voice, shrill and full of terror, cutting through the snow-heavy air like a shard of glass. Help! Please! Someone help me! Everyone froze. Hollister was on his feet in an instant, rifle raised, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. The scream came again, closer this time, followed by a desperate sob. It's a trap, he hissed. He knew it. It was too perfect, too clean. But Hosa was already at the door, her face a mask of anguish. That's a woman! We have to help! No! Hollister grabbed her arm, his grip like iron. They're trying to draw us out, to separate us. But what if it's real? She cried, her eyes filling with tears. What if it's one of our sisters who got lost? Another scream, this one broken and choked off. It was the sound of pure despair. Alawa's face was grim. We decide now who we are. Hollister looked at each of their faces, torn between his gut instinct and their humanity. His heart hammered. He made a choice. I go, alone. No one follows me. Bar the door behind me and do not open it until I return. They argued, but he was already gone, melting into the darkness like a wraith. He moved silently, using every shadow, every rock for cover. The screaming had stopped. There was only the sound of the wind now, and his own ragged breathing. He followed the memory of the sound to the tree line, and then he saw her. She was real. A woman, barefoot in the snow, her lips split and bleeding, her clothes torn. She stumbled towards him, her arms outstretched, sobbing. They're coming, please. They're right there. Just as she reached him, an arrow whistled past his head and embedded itself in the trunk of a pine tree. Thwack! He reacted without thinking. He grabbed the woman, yanking her down behind a large boulder just as another arrow thudded into the snow where they had been standing. A third skipped off the rock with a sharp crack. He saw a shadow move on the ridge above. He didn't fire. Not yet. He waited, counted his breaths. Then he raised the rifle, aimed, and fired one shot. The shadow dropped. A cry echoed through the woods. Not the cry of a man, the cry of a boy. Hollister swore under his breath, a wave of sickness washing over him. Another silhouette appeared, running towards the fallen figure. A brother? A father? Hollister didn't shoot again. He couldn't. He hauled the wounded woman to her feet. Blood was soaking through her dress now, dark against the white snow. He half-dragged, half-carried her back to the cabin. The door flew open, and hands pulled them inside. Blood stained the floorboards. Hosa ripped strips of linen for bandages, while Alawa frantically stoked the fire. Hollister checked the woman's pulse. It was shallow, thready. Alawa recognized her. Kaya, she whispered in horror. She was with us when we fled. Kaya could barely speak. She managed only one word, her eyes wild with terror. Brothers! Then she went still. She died 2 hours later, in a stranger's cabin, on a mountain that had offered her nothing but a violent end. Hollister buried her himself, out by the charred ruins of the smokehouse. He worked alone under the cold moonlight, the thud of his shovel the only sound. No one sang, no one prayed. He marked the grave with a simple, flat stone. That night, the cabin was dark. They didn't light a fire. They sat in the suffocating silence, listening to the wind howl, each of them lost in their own private hell. He had killed a boy to save a woman who had died anyway. What kind of victory was that? But the mountain wasn't finished with its tests. The next morning, Hosa opened the door to a new shock. Lying on the step was a bundle of furs. She let out a small gasp. Inside, nestled amongst the soft rabbit pelts, was a baby, a newborn girl, clean, swaddled, and quietly sleeping, left for them. And resting on top of the bundle was another feather. This one was pure white. The message was clear. You killed one of ours, but you took in one of his victims. Now, take in another. We are watching. We are judging. Hollister took the child in his arms. She was so small, her skin still warm from wherever she had come. She smelled of wood smoke and milk. What do we do now? Hosa whispered, her voice trembling. Hollister looked from the sleeping infant to the faces of the 10 women who had become his unlikely family. He looked at the grave outside his window. He looked at the blood stain on his floor that he hadn't been able to scrub clean. We name her, he said, his voice stronger than he felt. And we raise her, same as the others. He didn't need to ask their opinion. He saw the answer in their eyes. By that night, they had named the baby Alisi. Nanton, who had been fussy all day, grew quiet when she was laid beside him, as if he recognized a kindred spirit in the storm. 3 nights passed. No tracks, no arrows, no screams. The silence was heavier than ever. On the 4th night, Hollister woke to the sound of voices. Low muttering, quiet laughter, the rustle of many bodies moving through the trees. He crept to the window, his heart in his throat. A line of figures was moving along the far ridge, dozens of them. They carried torches and spears, and riding in the center, mounted on a powerful black horse, was a man in a white fur coat, his face painted in stark patterns of red and black. Hollister's blood ran cold. He had seen that man once before, years ago. A war chief, a man exiled from his own people for his ruthlessness, a man who believed the mountain was his, and his alone. And now he was here. He had come to reclaim his territory. The cabin would not hold against a force like that. Not for long. Their fragile peace was about to be burned to the ground. The first light of dawn was a liar. It crept over the peaks, painting the snow in shades of gray and pale rose, but it brought no warmth, no comfort. It only illuminated their cage. Hollister hadn't slept. He'd sat in his chair all night, the rifle across his lap, watching as the torches on the far ridge finally winked out one by one. The war chief and his procession were gone. Or they were pretending to be. The snow outside the cabin was a smooth, untouched blanket, but Hollister knew better. There were no footprints because they had covered them. It was a ghost war, a war of nerves. They were still out there, circling, tightening the noose, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. He rose stiffly, his joints screaming in protest. The women and children were still asleep, a tangled knot of humanity on the floor. Hosa's head rested on Alawa's shoulder. Taita had curled herself around the baskets holding Alisi and Nanton, a protective barrier of warmth and love. The sight of them, so peaceful and vulnerable, twisted something sharp in Hollister's chest. He slipped outside. The air was so cold it felt like glass. He scanned the horizon, his eyes missing nothing. A rabbit darted into the tree line. A bird trilled a lonely song. It was too quiet, dangerously quiet. Then he saw it. A rock on the ridge, 100 yards away. It was freshly disturbed, one edge darker than the rest where a boot had turned it. They were close, so close. He followed the ridge east, his path taking him behind the burned-out smokehouse to the small, snow-covered mound that was Kaya's grave. He stopped beside the stone marker, tipping his hat in a gesture of respect. A silent prayer formed in his mind, not of practiced words, but of a tired ache that had settled deep in his soul. And that's when he saw the feather. It was black, just like the first one, and it had been driven deep into the wood of the makeshift cross he had planted. It wasn't an offering. It was a desecration, a final warning. He returned to the cabin to find the women stirring. The smell of boiling milk and pine filled the air. It was an illusion of peace, and everyone knew it. They were here again, he said, his voice flat. He laid the black feather on the table. On the ridge. They left this on Kaya's grave. Alawa stood, wrapping a shawl tighter around her shoulders. Are they trying to scare us out? No, Hollister replied, his gaze distant. They're trying to see what we're made of, how far we'll go before we break. Taita's young eyes narrowed. What happens when they find out we don't break? He didn't have an answer for that. Instead, he pulled the old chest from under the table and spread his maps across the floor. They were maps of the mountains, of escape routes, of passes through the canyons he hadn't looked at in years. We need to think about leaving, he said. The word hung in the air like a death sentence. They had fought to stay. They had rebuilt the smokehouse, patched the roof, and coaxed sprouts from dried beans in jars in the root cellar. Alisi and Nanton were growing, thriving against all odds. This place, this cold, hard mountain, was becoming a home. You mean run, Hosa said, her voice barely a whisper. I mean live, he countered, his voice raw. But Alawa shook her head, her face set like stone. We have run enough, from soldiers, from our own people, from everyone. This place, this is where we stop running. Hollister looked at her, at the fire in her eyes, and felt a surge of pride so fierce it surprised him. He didn't want to leave either. He had carved this home from stone and silence, built it with 30 years of grief. But the war chief was not a man who tolerated defiance. In his eyes, they were a stain on his mountain, a mistake that needed to be erased. Just think on it, Hollister said, folding the maps away. That afternoon, the first real warmth in weeks broke through the clouds. Sunlight streamed down, melting the snow in slow, glistening drips from the eaves. It felt like a gift, a brief window of respite. They spent the day preparing for the inevitable, taking turns watching the tree line while others worked. Hollister strung tripwires of tin and glass from branches, anything that would rattle and give them a moment's warning. But as night fell, the torches returned, not just on one ridge, but on all of them, a circle of fire tightening around them. There were hundreds. The war chief was showing his numbers, It was over. They had days at most. Then, a new crisis. While Taida was patrolling near the frozen brook, she heard a whimper. It was soft, almost lost beneath the wind. She followed it carefully, her heart pounding. Behind a field of boulders where the snow had drifted deep, she found him. A child. A boy, no more than 6 years old, barefoot, dressed in thin buckskin, shivering so violently his teeth chattered. She knelt slowly, whispering to him in her native tongue. The boy didn't answer. He just held out a small, trembling hand. In it was a rag, soaked in blood. His own. Taida wrapped him in her own coat and carried him back to the cabin. Hollister met them at the door, his heart twisting into a knot. The boy had a necklace with a carved eagle stone, but no name, no voice. His back was a crisscross of fresh lashes. He had been whipped, beaten, and left in the snow to die. It wasn't a punishment. It was a message. This is what we do to the weak. This is what we will do to you. They brought him inside, fed him warm broth, and let him sleep by the fire. He didn't cry. He just stared, his eyes wide and vacant, as if he had left his soul out there in the snow. That night, Hollister dreamed of fire. He saw the cabin engulfed in flames, heard the screams of the women and babies. He saw the war chief standing in the middle of the inferno, a triumphant smile on his painted face. He woke up in a cold sweat to the sound of Alici's crying, but this was different. It was a pained, frantic wail. Hossa rushed to her side. The baby was burning up, her skin red and damp. "The fever," Hossa gasped. "We need willow bark. More water." But they were out. The stream was 2 miles down the mountain, through enemy lines. It was a suicide mission. "I'll go," Hollister said, already grabbing his rifle. "No!" Alawa cried. "They'll kill you before you get 100 yards." "I have to," he said, his voice grim. He packed quickly, a canteen, his rifle, a length of rope. He slipped out into the pre-dawn darkness before anyone could argue further. Every step was a gamble. Every rustle of leaves, every crack of a twig under his boot sounded like a gunshot in the silent woods. He made it to the stream. He filled his canteen, his hands shaking, and began to dig at the frozen roots of a willow tree. Then a branch snapped behind him. He spun around, raising his rifle. 3 Apache warriors, their faces painted for war, stood watching him from the shadows. They held spears, their points sharpened to a deadly gleam. This was it. This was the end. Hollister slowly, deliberately lowered his rifle and raised his empty hands. He spoke the few words of their language he remembered from his youth, words of peace, of respect. They didn't attack. They just watched him, their eyes unreadable. Then one of them stepped forward. He dropped a bundle at Hollister's feet. It was a blanket, and inside were dried roots, medicinal herbs, and even a small carved rattle. "For the baby," the warrior said in perfect English. Then, as silently as they had appeared, they melted back into the trees. Hollister stood stunned, his mind reeling. They weren't just enemies. They were something else, something more complicated. He rushed back to the cabin. They boiled the herbs, bathed Alici's skin. By morning, her fever had broken. She slept peacefully, a tiny smile on her lips. Hollister sat beside her for hours, staring at the bundle of herbs. "What changed?" Alawa asked, her voice full of wonder. He didn't have an answer, but deep in his gut, a new feeling was taking root. They weren't just being judged. They were being tested. Some of the enemy wanted them dead, but others were watching to see what kind of man he was, to see if he was worthy of this mountain, and maybe, just maybe, some of them were hoping he would survive. The next day, the beaten boy spoke his first word. He pointed to the carved eagle on his necklace. "Kyun," he whispered. It meant brother. Then he pointed to the sleeping Alici. "Sister." That evening, Hollister called everyone together. He laid the maps out on the floor one last time, not as a plan of escape, but as a declaration. "We stay," he said. And for the first time, no one argued. Because for the first time on that cold, lonely mountain, They didn't feel like they were alone. The wind changed after that. It still scraped at the eaves of the cabin, but the sound was different. Less like a threat, more like a song. The torches on the ridges did not return. The silence that settled over the mountain was not the silence of waiting, but the silence of watching. Hollister knew they were still out there, but something had shifted in the invisible war between them. The boy, Kuhn, became Hollister's shadow. He still rarely spoke, but he communicated with his eyes with the tilt of his head. He was a survivor, but he was still a child looking for an anchor. He found it in Alice. Whenever he looked at the baby girl, a softness would enter his gaze, as if she were the one thing in this broken world that still made sense. Inside the cabin, a quiet transformation was taking place. The women were no longer just refugees. They were pioneers. They had turned the root cellar into a pantry stocked with dried squirrel, apples from a hidden grove, and wild oats gathered by hand. They stitched new moccasins from scraps of hide and braided strong thread from pine bark. And the babies, Nanton and Alice, were thriving. Nanton was crawling, exploring every corner of the cabin with a determined curiosity. Alice's laughter, a sound like tiny bells, began to fill the small space, chasing away the last of the shadows. It was that sound that made Hollister pause one evening, a hammer in his hand as he repaired the porch railing. He set the hammer down, sat on the cold steps, and bowed his head. He had lived a lifetime without the echo of a child in his home. Now, it was the symphony that defined his world. Then, just after dusk one night, a new figure approached the cabin. No torch, no weapon. Just a slow, tired gait and a limp that spoke of old battles fought and lost. Hollister rose, his rifle in his hand but held loosely at his side. The figure stepped into the faint light from the doorway. He was a white man, worn thin by the road, his skin like tanned leather. "Name's Emmett James," the man said, tipping a battered hat. "Was told a man lived up here, a man who took in lost souls." Hollister didn't lower the rifle. "Who told you?" The stranger gestured vaguely towards the valley. "No one, just followed the feeling, looking for a place to be. Ain't asking for much, just a floor to sleep on and a chance to earn my keep." Alawa had stepped out onto the porch behind Hollister. Her dark eyes scanned the stranger, her gaze so intense it felt like it could strip a man down to his bones. After a long, tense moment, she gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. Hollister sighed and stepped aside. "Floor's hard. Fire's warm. That enough for you?" A faint smile touched Emmett's lips. "More than I've had in a year." Emmett said little that night. He just warmed his hands by the fire and stared into the flames as if seeing ghosts. But the next morning, he was up before dawn, chopping wood without being asked. He mended the barn roof. He fed the chickens. He worked with the quiet efficiency of a man who lets his hands do the talking. 3 days passed. Emmett slept in the woodshed and never took a meal until after the children had eaten. He fit into the rhythm of the mountain home as if he had always been there. Then came the night of the blood moon. The sky turned a terrifying rusty red, and a cold snap froze the world solid. Hollister woke with a familiar dread. Something was wrong. Alawa found it at sunrise. Another feather, black. But this one was broken in half, left on the doorframe like a promise of violence. Emmett stared at it, his face grim. "Means they're close," he said, his voice low. Hollister nodded. "Means they're done waiting." That evening, they gathered around the fire. "They'll come in days, maybe less," Hollister said, his voice devoid of hope. "They're not testing us anymore. They're coming to finish it." Taita's voice was steady. "Then we make our stand. They'll outnumber us 10-1, Emmett muttered. Alawa looked up, her eyes blazing. "So did the blizzard. We're still here." "I'm not willing to risk Alice or Nanton," Hollister said, his voice breaking for the first time. It was Hosa who answered, her voice quiet but firm. "We won't have to risk them. We will protect them. But this is our home now. You said it yourself. We stay. One by one they all agreed. Even Kuhn, so small and silent, stood tall, his hand clutching the carved eagle on his chest. This was his home. These were his sisters. He would not run. They spent the next days fortifying the cabin. Hollister and Emmett dug shallow trenches by torchlight, fashioned crude spears from sharpened saplings, and strung more tripwires through the trees. The women boiled tar to pour from the windows and melted tallow for torches. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and trapped, but they were not broken. On the 5th night, the dogs began to bark. The ridgeline above them exploded with light, a wall of torches, a sea of fire in the dark. But they didn't charge. Instead, a single figure walked forward, alone, unarmed, draped in black furs. The war chief. Hollister stepped out to meet him, his hands empty, his rifle slung over his back. "You shelter traitors," the war chief said, his English broken but his meaning clear. "You hide them from justice." "They're not traitors," Hollister replied, his voice steady. "They're survivors." "Same thing," the chief sneered. He pointed a finger towards the cabin. "The women, the children, they return with me, now. They would rather die." The chief's face was a mask of cold fury. "That is allowed." "Then you'll have to kill me first," Hollister said. The chief let out a short, harsh laugh. "That, too, is allowed." He turned and walked back to his line of fire. The ultimatum had been delivered. That night, the cabin was silent. Then, at midnight, the snow began to fall, thick and fast, a white curtain descending on their final act, and then came the war cries. They rushed from the trees like demons, silent until they were on top of them. Emmett fired the first shot, then Hollister. The women moved like smoke, herding the children into the root cellar as the first attackers hit the door. The night exploded into a symphony of violence. Screams, gunfire, the splintering of wood. The snow turned red, the cabin became a slaughterhouse. For every man who breached the door, 2 fell. Alawa fought with a carving knife, her movements a deadly dance. Hosa swung a heavy log, cracking skulls with a terrifying strength born of a mother's desperation. Hours passed in a red blur. Then, a scream from the woodshed. Emmett. Hollister ran, slipping in the blood-slick snow. He found Emmett on the ground, a spear shaft protruding from his shoulder, but he was alive, and standing over him, holding a bloody blade, was Kuhn. His eyes were wide, but his hands were steady. The silent, broken boy had saved him. As the first gray light of dawn broke over the mountain, the war cries faded. The torches flickered out. They were gone, scattered, defeated. Hollister dropped to his knees in the snow, breathless, his body screaming in protest. Behind him, the cabin still stood, scarred, burned, and bleeding, but standing. And from inside, a sound drifted out into the cold morning air. A baby's cry. Life. For the first time in 30 winters, the mountain felt like a home, and it had been bought with blood and fire. The aftermath of the battle was a landscape of frozen violence. The snow around the cabin was a canvas of red and black, a testament to the night's fury. The roof was singed, the walls splintered, but the heart of the home, the hearth, still held a warm coal. They had survived. Emmett lay on a cot for a week, hovering between this world and the next. Hosa stitched his shoulder with a steady hand, her face a mask of concentration. He never complained. He just watched them, his eyes full of a weary gratitude. "Should have died 3 times that night," he'd mutter to Hollister. "Guess I'm still behind on my dues." The women didn't cry, not at first. They cleaned the blood, tended the wounded, and buried the dead, their dead and the enemy's, in a single large grave on the ridge. They worked in a grim, efficient silence. The tears came days later, in the quiet of the night, when the children were asleep. Taita and Alawa held hands by the fire, their bodies trembling with the phantom shocks of the fight. Hosa wept silently, rocking Alisi and Nanton, her grief a river of gratitude and loss. They had made it. They had actually made it. Hollister kept moving, He fixed the door, he patched the walls, he rebuilt. But there were moments he would stop, hammer in hand, and stare at the spot where Kuhn had stood, blood on his hands and a terrifying emptiness in his eyes. One night, he found the boy sitting alone, staring at the stars. "Kuhn," Hollister said gently, sitting beside him, "you're not a killer." The boy didn't look at him. "You did what you had to do," Hollister continued. A single tear tracked a path down Kuhn's dusty cheek. "You're not a killer," Hollister repeated, his voice softer. "You're a protector. There's a difference." The following morning, the women held a fire prayer. They gathered in a circle outside, and Alawa lit a ceremonial fire. They spoke no English, only their native tongue, their voices rising and falling in a song of sorrow and rebirth. Hollister watched from a distance, not wanting to intrude. He didn't understand the words, but he understood the meaning. It settled over the mountain like a benediction. The quiet that followed was different. It wasn't the silence of fear. It was the silence of peace. Then, a new sound. Hoofbeats. A single rider. Hollister stepped onto the porch, his rifle ready but not raised. The rider was a stranger, a traveler cloaked in buffalo hides. He dismounted slowly, his hands raised. "Name's Tobias," he said. "Heard there was trouble up in these woods. Found some stragglers down by the pass, running from something they wouldn't name." He looked at the scarred cabin, at the faces of the women who had come out to stand with Hollister. "Looks like they found it." "You need help up here?" Tobias asked. "We've got mouths to feed," Hollister admitted. "Wounds to mend. I can lend a hand, got 2 good legs and a strong back." Hollister looked him in the eye. "You believe in peace, Tobias?" The man nodded. "I believe in a full belly and a warm fire. If peace comes with that, then yes, sir, I do." Hollister offered his hand. "Then you're welcome here." Tobias fit in seamlessly. He was quiet, useful, and asked no questions. The barn was patched, traps were set, and the rhythm of life slowly returned. It wasn't just survival anymore. It was living. There was laughter. There was hope. One day, Hollister began laying stones on the far side of the cabin, a new foundation. "Building a new woodshed?" Emmett asked, hobbling over. "No." "A stable?" "No." Emmett squinted at the outline. "That looks like a schoolhouse." A faint smile touched Hollister's lips. "This is a home," he said, "but it needs to be bigger. For all of them, with room for more." Just as the first hints of spring began to soften the edges of the world, a letter arrived. A trapper brought it up from the town of Pine Ridge. The envelope was plain, with no return address. Hollister opened it with cautious fingers. The message was short, the handwriting hurried. "More are coming. 15. Maybe more. Young ones. Alone. They need a place." I remembered the mountain. There was no name, just those words. A new wave was coming. Hollister showed the letter to Alawa. She read it and looked up, her eyes clear. "Then we get ready." 15? Taita whispered. "That's more than this roof can hold." "Then we'll build more roofs," Hollister said, his voice firm. "Before the thaw." That night, the sound of hammers rang through the mountains once again. They weren't just rebuilding a cabin. They were building a refuge, a sanctuary, a place for the lost, for the wounded, for the ones the world had forgotten. The mountain had been a place of silence and grief. Now it was becoming a place of hope. And its story was just beginning. The thaw came early, washing the last of the blood from the snow and revealing the rich, dark earth beneath. The world was waking up, and with it, a new chapter for the community on the ridge. Hollister saw them first. A thin, wavering line of figures stumbling up the slope from the valley below. 15 of them. He didn't feel panic. He felt a sense of purpose so profound, it settled his very soul. "They're coming," he said, as he walked back to the settlement. The words acted like a spark. Emmett dropped his hammer. Alawa grabbed blankets. Hosa set the largest kettle over the fire. They worked without speaking, a well-oiled machine of compassion. By the time the children arrived, tattered, red-eyed, and limping with exhaustion, the cabin was a beacon of warmth and safety. None of them could have been older than 11. Some clung to each other, others walked in a daze of shock and hunger. Hollister opened the door wide. "You're home," he said. The oldest girl, Saya, stepped inside and looked around, her eyes taking in the fire, the food, the faces watching her with kindness. "This isn't what we thought it would be," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "It's warmer." "It's what you needed," Hollister replied, kneeling to meet her gaze. "That's all it has to be." She reached out and took his hand, her small fingers trembling. "Thank you." Slowly, gently, life began to seep back into them. They devoured the simple bean soup as if it were a feast. A boy with no front teeth laughed at one of Emmett's stories, a sound so pure and unexpected it made everyone smile. Within days they were helping with chores. Saya swept the floor. 2 boys carried water. They were finding their place. And by the 4th day, they played. Kuhn started it with a gently tossed snowball. Soon the air was filled with laughter, a sound brighter and more powerful than any storm. Hollister watched from the porch, a feeling he couldn't name swelling in his chest. It wasn't just grief for Ruth anymore. It was something heavier, but far more alive. It was the weight of family, but peace had to be guarded. That night, he gathered the adults. "We need a plan," he said, "to build something that lasts." "A school," Alawa said immediately. "A garden," Hosa added. "A wall," Emmett muttered. They were all right. The days that followed were a blur of purposeful labor. The schoolhouse rose stone by stone, built by many hands. Tobias the traveler returned, this time to stay, and taught the children how to fish and whittle. The settlement was no longer a cabin. It was becoming a village, a home carved from the heart of the mountain. Then, news came that traders were gathering in the valley. It meant supplies, but it also meant their secret was about to be exposed. When Hollister and his unconventional family arrived in the town of Pine Hollow, whispers followed them like a shadow. He was remembered. But he was different now. He was no longer a hermit. He was a patriarch. As they were loading their wagon, a man in a fine coat approached them. "Sheriff Klein," he said, his eyes sharp. "Territorial authority. I've heard stories about your settlement." "We're building a life," Hollister said evenly, "not a threat." "That's not for me to decide," Klein replied. "I'll be up for a visit next full moon, to see for myself. If it looks like a proper settlement, we file it with the government. If it looks like something else, well, we'll see." The threat was unspoken, but clear. The law could undo everything they had built. Back on the ridge, a new kind of preparation began. The children painted pine cones for luck and hung them from the trees. They weren't just building a school. They were building a future they were determined to protect. When Sheriff Klein arrived with 2 deputies, they were met not with fear, but with life. The schoolhouse was finished, filled with 15 children learning their letters. 10 women prepared a communal lunch. A field was sprouting with onions and carrots. Klein walked the grounds for hours, his face unreadable. He spoke to Alawa. He watched Emmett teach the boys to mend a fence. He listened as Hosa read a story to the younger children. When it was time to leave, he folded his notebook. "This isn't a town," he said slowly. "It's not even a village." He paused, looking at Hollister. "It's something else." He turned to his men. "We write nothing. This place doesn't exist on any map. Let it be." Then to Hollister, he added, "But if you ever need a new roof, you let me know. I hammer a straight nail." That evening, as dusk fell like a soft blanket, Hollister climbed the ridge alone. He sat in his usual spot, where the silence used to live. But it wasn't silent anymore. It was filled with the sounds of laughter, of stories, of school bells and stomping feet. He thought of Ruth, and he knew with a certainty that settled his soul that this was what she would have wanted. He had not just survived his grief, He had built a legacy from it. 5 years passed. The mountain settlement thrived. The children grew, their laughter echoing through the pines. Weddings were celebrated, and new babies were born into the warmth of the community. Hollister, now leaning on a cane carved by one of the girls, watched over them all, his heart full. One day, Tobias, now old and white-haired, sat with him on the ridge. "Heard the mountain grew a town," he said with a grin. Hollister smiled, his gaze resting on the bustling village below. "Not a town," he said. "No?" Tobias asked. Hollister shook his head, the answer as clear and true as the mountain air. "Family. They were bound not by blood but by something stronger, by the shared memory of a storm, by the fire of a battle, and by the enduring hope they had built together, one stone at a time." If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe for more tales of survival and the human spirit.